We forget the many studies that link sexual well-being to general well-being, and that many of the problems mothers will, on the surface, be attributed to the very real and heavy responsibilities of parenting, but there will also be, all too often, sexually related problems that remain unsaid and therefore neglected. We need then to get to MCH clinics to talk about possible integration of reproductive and sexual health. Be prepared. MCH personnel will often have a more conservative outlook towards sexuality, but this is often because we do not talk enough with them. Sometimes too, if you do talk with them, you will uncover some fascinating insights. I never forget one physician in a city health clinic dealing mainly with maternal health. She was telling me about how difficult it was to convince mothers to initiate breastfeeding right after the birth of their children. And she explained this was because hospital personnel actually tell mothers that it's hard to breastfeed. So when mothers begin breastfeeding and the milk flow is slow and weak, many stop right away, believing indeed that breastfeeding is difficult. What this physician did was to tell mothers to get the help of their husbands. This physician giggled as she mentioned this, and I realized there was a sexual component to this. And why not? I later did some internet search and found that in several countries, breastfeeding counselors do talk about husbands or partners being required to stimulate, the pun intended, breastfeeding. Let me be bolder and go a step further. How many of you dare to talk about the participation of the male in breastfeeding beyond initial stimulation? You probably feel it is too sensitive and won't. But mothers and fathers do have questions about this and may not want to ask. Yet, in many cultures, there is a kind of underground culture that does deal with the sexual aspects of breastfeeding. Many years ago, a breastfeeding advocate told me that in their province of Quezon, to the south of Manila, she met older women who had what they claimed to be a surefire cure for cracked nipples resulting from breastfeeding. And this is a Tagalog term, so excuse my pronunciation. Lavay ng lavin, the grandmothers called it, the eagle's saliva. Thank you, I was expecting that. Our breastfeeding advocate was flabbergasted and asked, "But how do you get eagle saliva?" Oh, but the grandmothers laughed and crackled their advice. "You have to look for it at night, in the dark." Our breastfeeding activist still couldn't get it. And the grandmothers finally told her, "Your husbands will help. You get it from your husband." Have you figured out what eagle saliva is? And doesn't it make sense? This eagle saliva as emollient, a moisturizer? Now I wonder how many of our natural family planning advocates include eagle saliva in their education. We need to recognize sexuality permeates our lives at all stages, in different circumstances. Let's do a systematic walkthrough now to identify the many blinders we have in our program. First, childhood. We recognize the needs of children and adolescents who are sexually abused, but not much more. We recognize the need for sexuality education among children, but concede to conservatives by agreeing maybe it should be later, perhaps around adolescence. But the biological facts are clear. Even before puberty, there is already attraction, heterosexual or homosexual, in children. The parents among you surely have seen this. Your daughter giggling away as she watches Justin Timberlake or K-pop or some K-pop idol. She has a crush and there are feelings, and she knows she has, but can't understand yet. We worry about what to tell our daughters in relation to menage, but forget that middle school childhood is a complex time too. The body, the brain, already actively sexual. Crushes, puppy love, they are largely innocent, but they can also make children vulnerable. We had an award-winning film in the Philippines, which was about the life of Norman Oliveros, and there's again a Tagalog word, but it's about the transition of a girl into adolescence, which actually refers to the transition to female puberty. But the main character of the movie is Norman Oliveros, a boy, or more specifically, a transgender boy. It is a warm and tender film that includes this boy getting a crush on their neighborhood policeman. The complications that come out: Norman's brothers are petty criminals, are non-sexual, but the film suggests sexual attraction, kept to a platonic level. In the real world, there can be no more than the platonic. Note too, that the attractions can be among these very young children. Again, boy-girl, boy-boy, girl-girl. A few years back, we had a case in the Philippines of a young 13-year-old male shooting to death another male about his age out of jealousy. This is, of course, very extreme, but was a reminder that young love can be very young indeed. It was unfortunate that the public discussions of that case centered instead on the homosexual nature of the relationship, on the dangers of the internet where the two had met. The idea that young children can fall in love was just unspeakable. Puppy love is all we seek to concede. Still on children, we continue to deny sexuality issues around sexual orientation, gender identity. We have young lesbians and gays and transgenders, and their needs are neglected at a time when they are most conflicted, dealing with so many other challenges in their lives. A sexuality-related issue among children, often unseen, is that of adopted children. In many cultures, people will wait till their adopted children are teenagers before telling them so. The timing could not be more wrong, given that adolescents are grappling with questions about who they are, what they want to be. Then, we one day tell them, "Son, you are adopted." Two of my own adopted children are from a young teenage mother, herself adopted, and told only in her adolescence that she was adopted. Was it surprising then that she rebelled and began early dating and ended up with early pregnancies? In even more dire straits are those who are never told, yet their adoption a matter of public knowledge in the neighborhood. They will hear the stories and may not be able to find the psychosocial support to deal with the adoption. Sexual rebellion becomes a response. Moving on to the sexuality needs of special children, let's not forget the physical development continues, even for such children. Girls go into menage, boys and girls do get attracted. And what about the sexuality of children with chronic illnesses like cancers or HIV? When we get to adolescence, we think mainly of PMS, the demographer's term for premarital sex. But there's much more, and again we fail to link these to the life stage context. Sexuality issues for this group relate very much again to identity questions, to philosophical issues around life. In schools we fret about possible harassment by adults, but there are also cases of adolescents harassing adolescents, spurred by the need to prove one's masculinity. Society's response, oh, is just testosterone drive. We get to adulthood and presume once parenting starts, sexuality takes a back seat. That's too easy a conclusion though. Sexuality becomes more complicated, shaped again by many contexts. An example is the sandwich generation, those who have to care for very young children as well as aging parents. All living under one roof. There's the parents and the parents-in-law intervening. Many of you know of the Packard Foundation's program in India convincing parents-in-law and parents to not pressure newlywed couples about having their first baby soon after marriage. Postponing this first child has dramatic results on the life of newlywed couples. We know, though, the pressure is not just for having a first child, but to have a second and a third and a fourth, or to have a son after 6 or 7 daughters. We forget the needs of working parents, more and more now of women, or of parents who are studying. As Dean, I always extend an extra warm handshake during commencement exercises for those who are able to finish their master's or PhD program while raising children and a husband. Some of the gender blindness can affect men, and here I will be personal. Last year, when one of my department faculty members, a woman, adopted a child, everyone was concerned, excusing her from working committees and finding ways to lighten her teaching load. I could not help but comment, "Hey, I have adopted 4 children, but I've never been offered help with my teaching. Not only that, you pushed me to go through 3 terms as department chair, then conscripted me to become a dean. I could add now, and also the vice chancellor." It's presumed that men are pretty useless at parenting. People forgetting there are single fathers like myself, as well as fathers with partners who take fathering seriously. And so the politics of everyday life and sexuality unfolds. We are not doing enough for middle-aged people dealing with the complexities of perimenopause and menopause, as well as an alleged andropause. We presume, too, that middle-aged people have stabilized with their identities, their visions of life, and forget midlife crisis will still include questions about their sexual identity. I've lost count of the times when I'd hear of a colleague leaving a spouse for someone else of the same sex. It is not just a matter of repressed sexualities. At midlife, same-sex bonds become more important for many people and could take on sexual dimensions. And then there is geriatric sexuality. Not just unspoken, but something we don't even want to think about. Yet one physician friend told me about how he was approached by an elderly woman, a family friend, asking if it was still all right to have sex with her husband, both of them being in their 70s. The physician said, "Of course, it's all right." 2 weeks later, she called and said he was right, but had another question. Was it all right to have oral sex? He said, "Sure, no harm in trying." Another 2 weeks, and she called to say it was indeed all right, and better without the dentures. My point is that we cannot pigeonhole people. We see a gay man and presume he's not a parent. Well, many are parenting without the social and legal support mechanisms. Many of you know of this crazy guy who adopted 4 children and has to write his newspaper columns and conference speeches at 3 in the morning, something I learned from women friends who have to run corporations and schools. The stories, the anecdotes float around, but we need to compile them, to come up with good reference materials. Some technical information will be needed. Are there risks for sex after a heart attack or a stroke? How do you manage sexuality when you're on drugs that affect erectile function? The conference theme resonates as we think about personal lives. Many, not quite about crisis, or at least not in terms of earthquakes and typhoons or political upheavals. But yes, there will be crises too in our lives, where sexuality figures in unexpected ways. There is, after all, among the diverse reasons for having sex, sex to console, sex to comfort, and sex to heal. I know a couple whose children were well grown up and one day they had sex to celebrate their son's passing a high school entrance exam. You guessed it, that son soon had a little sister. As I write this, I'm feeling a tinge of sadness, not being able to be with you. I would have wanted to listen to your stories as well, but I am sure our paths will cross. And again, I thank you for listening and participating in this conference. I wish you all the very best and ask that you keep remembering the best of our personal lives, sexual or non-sexual, should inform us all in what we do around reproductive and sexual health. Thank you.